All right, today I'm going to tell you about one of the most bizarre strategies in US election history. So, a presidential election today consists of two main parties, right? You've got the Republicans and you've got the Democrats, and each one of them nominates one person for the presidency and vice presidency. There are also so called third party candidates, which also elect their own candidates for the presidency and vice presidency, and in general, they'll siphon off about 1 or 2% of the popular vote from the major candidates. But because they only siphon off 1 or 2% of the popular vote, they're seldom seen as serious contenders in a race. So the major political parties kind of hate third party candidates because they risk siphoning off votes that would have gone to them and will instead go to a candidate that isn't going to win. We can see this very clearly in the 1912 election when Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the election with about 42% of the popular vote, and that's because third-party candidate Teddy Roosevelt with the Bull Moose Party siphoned off, a good 27% of what would have gone to Republican candidate William Howard Taft, and that resulted in a Woodrow Wilson victory. Of course, this shows a pretty major weakness of the US voting system because it requires voters to choose between the lesser of two evils by voting for a candidate that they might not align with as much simply to prevent the person that they really don't like from winning. But that's a discussion for another time. All right, so with all that in mind, let's talk about the 1836 election. Take a look at this election results map. Democratic Party nominee Martin Van Buren took first with 170 electoral votes, and runner-up Whig Party candidate William Henry Harrison received 73. But as you can see, that leaves quite a few unclaimed states, and that's because the third place candidate, Hugh White, won 2 states and 26 electoral votes. But wait a second. Massachusetts and South Carolina are still unclaimed. That's because fourth place candidate Daniel Webster won Massachusetts and its 14 electoral votes, and in fifth place, Wiley Mangum won South Carolina's 11 electoral votes. So at face value, it looks like this election had 3 third-party candidates that took away votes from the 2 major candidates. The 4 runner-ups were all members of the same party. Yeah, that's right. The Whigs nominated 4 people for the presidency. So from the beginning of this election cycle, the Whig Party was obviously in a lot of trouble. The Democratic Party nominee Martin Van Buren had already been vice president under the previous president Andrew Jackson, and he was pretty popular, right? So it looked like from the get-go that he was going to win. And on top of that, the Whigs had a hell of a time trying to figure out who they were even going to nominate for president. So in the northern states, Major General William Henry Harrison seemed like the obvious choice to them, but the southern states had already been campaigning for Tennessee Senator Hugh White. Meanwhile, Massachusetts felt that their Senator Daniel Webster was the best bet, and South Carolina liked North Carolina Senator Wiley Mangum. So how do they resolve this conflict? They said, screw it, and ran all 4 of them. So why do they do this? As we saw, having more than one candidate with similar values will usually bring down all of those candidates. But the genius of this strategy becomes more clear when we investigate how one becomes the president-elect. So in this presidential election, there were 294 electoral votes up for grabs. And the first person to get a majority of these, in this case 148, will be chosen as the next president. However, if no candidate can receive a majority of the electoral votes, then the election is thrown to Congress in the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote from the top 3 candidates for who they think should be the next president. So the Whigs figured that if they could get enough electoral votes from different regions in the country, then they could force the election to go to the House of Representatives, where they had been steadily gaining seats. And so, the 1836 election became a game of preventing Van Buren from getting a majority of the votes so that Harrison and White could face off against him in the House. There is one slight problem with that, though, because remember, even from the beginning, the Whigs were having trouble deciding on one candidate, right? So if this had happened, that they had forced the election into the House, hopefully they would have been able to bunker down on one candidate, but we don't know. So as we saw, Mangum got South Carolina's 11 electoral votes, and Webster got Massachusetts' 14 electoral votes. White, the popular Southern Whig, got Tennessee and Georgia, taking their 26 electoral votes. That meant that Harrison had to get 96 electoral votes to prevent Martin Van Buren from getting the majority of 148 electoral votes. And you know what? He almost did it. He ended up finishing with 73 electoral votes, which is 23 shy of what he needed. So if he had won Pennsylvania and its 30 electoral votes, he would have done it. Unfortunately, he lost Pennsylvania, getting only about 49% of the popular vote. He trailed Martin Van Buren by about 4,000 votes. Since this election, no major political party has ever tried this strategy again, and I feel pretty confident in saying that it will never happen again. But you know what? Good for the Whigs. They tried something new and novel in the face of certain defeat, and even though it didn't really pan out for them, it makes a really good story.